Hi, I'm Peter Haddock, and welcome to another edition of the Content with Media podcast. This podcast is supported by Leica Geosystems, a 3D machine control and surveying specialist. Today, I've got a very special guest to really get us thinking about the future of our industry. And that guest, I'm very pleased to say, is Malcolm Dare, and he's the Executive Director, Commercial and Procurement for National Highways. And I've met him before numerous times, folks, and I know we're going to have a great discussion. Malcolm, welcome to the podcast here today. Thanks for making time for me.
No worries. Good to be here.
So, Malcolm, what I wanted to do is, first of all, find out a little bit about yourself. You've been in the industry for some time now, and you actually are in charge of a team of people at National Highways that are really making a difference and have actually put in a lot of things that changed our world and that changed the way that we're doing things already. So tell me a little bit about your background and the role and what your aims are as we move forward into 2023.
I've been at National Highways now just below 4 years. So I started end of January 2019. But before that, I'd spent all my time in manufacturing industry. So I've done everything from making fast-moving consumer goods, coffee, to nuclear submarines, to capital equipment, to some medium volume electronic stuff. And I've done either operations roles, running big chunks of factories and logistics and warehouses and things, or I've done, in National Highways speak, commercial procurement. So the 4 years has flown by, but the reality is your thinking is shaped by your experience you've had in life. So inevitably, my thinking is not shaped by, 20, 30 years in the civil industry. It's shaped by 20, 30 years in the sort of the manufacturing world. And, the team at National Highways, commercial procurement, we're up to about 450 people, which is, not badly manned compared with we need to be. And we've been changing a lot. So in the last 3 years, we've evolved from being quite sort of operationally focused to far more value adding to the business. And some of the stuff we're doing is lifting ideas from other industries and applying it. Some of the stuff is simply working out how we do things like carbon and social value. But the real cracking result we've had in the last 3 years is, and this is based on all the internal improvements we've been making. My professional body, which is SIPS, Chartered Institute of Procurement Supply, they do a corporate certification program. You've got 3 levels, standard, then you've got silver, gold, platinum. And we were certified in June last year at platinum. So we're one of only 16 organizations globally that are certified at that level. So we have been changing a lot, as you said, and it's quite good that other people are recognizing it from outside of the business, which is always good to see.
I think one of those changes that I've seen, Malcolm, and that has actually changed things over the last few years has been the way in which you've been interacting with the industry at large. So, you are one of the biggest clients in the sector, and you've got to get value from the government that invests a lot of money into National Highways to do the things that you do. But we've also seen the way in which you've now worked more collaboratively with the tier 1 suppliers, but also the supply chain and technology suppliers, so that actually we can come together and work out better ways to actually deliver projects, not just for the future, but for right now. And it's these sort of things that are really important and have led to the things like the mandating of 3D machine control and all of the integrations of data and sharing and information. Tell me a little bit about, what you have been achieving over those last few years and the significance moving forward to be able to do that and work sort of collaboratively all the way from university thinking to the practical end of delivery on site.
Yeah, so my observation when I joined was the industry was quite hierarchical in the sense you dealt with your supplier, but you didn't really understand what was underneath it. And as a business, I'm not sure National Highways really understood the tiered supply chain. But the experience I've had from other industries is the old adage is it's supply chains compete, not individual businesses. And we're investing 24 billion of taxpayers' money into the SRN during road period 2, which we're virtually halfway through. And if we're going to really optimize that taxpayers' money, we have to help drive and catalyze change in the supply base, which means as a client organization, we have to understand the supply base. It doesn't mean we're going to necessarily contract directly with tier 2s and tier 3s, because we want the main tier 1 contractor to own that. but we're really going to have to understand it. And so what we've been doing is A, really understanding, how the tiered structure works, B, understanding any criticality. And a good example of that level of tiered of understanding that we have now is when Mad Vlad decided to pop over the border into Ukraine, the directive from the government was understand where all the Russian ownership of suppliers and organizations were. Now, it took us 3.5 to 4 weeks to understand that down to tier 4 level, but that was a lot quicker than many organizations because of the time we had spent previously investing in understanding the tiered supply base. The other part is it's all about collaboration at the end of the day. As a client organization, as I said before, we're investing taxpayers' money. If we don't catalyze change, which is one of our sort of unwritten objectives, if we don't catalyze change in the industry, how do we demonstrate that we're investing taxpayers' money as wisely as possible? And if you don't understand, the supply base, the supply chains that exist, how do you help people change and improve? I mean, the type of thing we've been doing is we're deliberately signifying our intent. So you take social value, you take carbon net zero, for instance. We deliberately are outlining our intent of where we want to be so that we're providing that sort of clarity and certainty to people so people can then decide whether they choose to invest in the direction we're going or not. No fossil fuel plant by 2030. We're just in the process of publishing detailed roadmaps for carbon reduction with asphalt, concrete and steel. And all of that work has been done with the supply base, the tier ones, the main players like the Hansons, Ayers, Tarmacs, etc., the trade bodies like the MPA and Eurobitume and others, so that we're building consensus within our sector as to where we're going. If we don't have that consensus, how do we hope to go at an increasing pace and drive lasting change that everyone can adopt and use going forward? But your point about universities, one of the early things we did, we joined the Manufacturing Technology Centre at Coventry, which is a cracking organisation. If you haven't been there, it's worth going to see. What you see in the MTC is they're using the latest type of manufacturing technology, and I thought initially it's because I'm familiar with them from other businesses, but they're investing heavily in the construction and the built sector as well. And so they're looking at things like 3D printing of concrete, big, complex 3D printing of concrete structures. And I'm accurate. It's a couple of years ago when I was last there. But if you don't work with those areas of innovation, how do we help people adopt? But everyone has to work with those people. So, and again, if you look at our supply base, a vast number of our suppliers are actually members of the MTC. And what the MTC is great at doing is it translates pure R&D into something you can physically use on the ground. So if we're not encouraging and working with and understanding where some of the latest thinking is going, how do we then as a client create the market that supports that innovation that's coming through? And that's the important piece as well around setting the certainty of direction, clarity of our intent so people know where they can invest their money. Everything I've said, it may be new, it may be pushing the boundaries within our sector, but it's the comforting factor is it's been done in many other industries. It's simply how do we help this sector, the highway sector, adopt proven techniques from other industries in order to go forward. We know it works. It's just how do we get it to work in our sector, which is the challenge.
And one of those key things that you've got as an asset yourself is your development centre, that you can actually take all of this work that's been done by universities, the testing that's been done at different centres, and actually put it into real world applications within your own development centre to test them in real world conditions. Because everything we know about the roads in the UK and infrastructure is we might be on the road one day and it's beautiful and sunny. We might be on the road another day and it's pouring with rain. We might actually be on black ice as we come down and the minuses that we've had recently. But we've got a structure that has to last the test of time, and actually we also have to maintain. So a lot of people see the highway network as, oh look, we're building a new road, we're doing this new structure here, but a large proportion of your work is actually maintaining that existing infrastructure as well. So testing and trialing these different things is really important, isn't it? And then being able to take them safely, which is equally important, to the actual real world job site outside of your development centre. How's that been working, and how have you been able to accelerate that transition from great idea, look, it looks great in the laboratory type scenario, all the way through to getting it onto sites and working?
In Marsh is a fantastic facility because you can play around with it, you can create different conditions, you can do loads of stuff there, which is great. And people forget when you, if you're building a new road like the A14, that road's going to be around for 50, 100, 150 years in one way, shape, or form. The technology, for instance, will change rapidly. And if you look at, and this is where Morton in the Marsh becomes really helpful, if you look at how the technology will change over the next 5 to 10 years, the digital road thinking that's going on, at some point, does it mean that you don't have road signs on certain motorways? Do you eliminate gantries because all of the technology is in the car that tells you what's going on? You can't just trial that on a road like the M1. You've got to trial it offline. You've got to make sure it works. You've got to learn. You've got to accelerate. But the other thing I've seen in other industries, you then have a reference set in your test facility. So you do all your development work on your reference set so that you know what you're then installing on the road network is proven, it works, it's reliable. So when it's on the road network, you're not debugging it, you're not playing with it to get it to work. So that style of development center is really, really key. If you look at my time with this shipbuilding and nuclear submarines, the weapon system, what was termed the combat system, which acquired the target, then ultimately fired the torpedo to potentially sink the target or fire the missile. You always had a reference set, and that reference set was constantly being updated and tested, and it was also used for training of the crew. But that ability to test offline and use it is really, really vital. And as we go forward, the pace of innovation has to accelerate. The pace of innovation just on the carbon piece, the pace of innovation in the productivity space has to go forward and accelerate. And you're going to have to do that offline because otherwise your speed of doing things on the road network will be too slow. Really, really important. But again, proven from other sectors. Other sectors do this routinely.
And this is where I'd like to start talking about the key things in the podcast here today, sort of technology and digitalisation, that sustainability, ESG, that roadmap to zero, and the ultimate benefits of the collaboration that we're going through. So, Malcolm, we've seen a lot change. And I think, to be honest, and I hope you would agree, that the pandemic is actually quite good for an acceleration of change because we had to work out how to work differently. We had to adopt safer ways of keeping people apart. And we also had to say, well, actually, we've now got the time to push technology and digitalisation faster than we had before. I mean, the fact that the Construction Leadership Council came together and brought all these organisations together to keep the industry going, in a matter of weeks and months instead of years to change things, has allowed us to say we can do this and we can jettison the more traditional and safer from an economics perspective, or safer from we know what we're doing, to actually adopt technology and digitalisation. What are your thoughts on that from a higher level? And then let's talk about some of the practical things that have actually delivered for you.
I mean, collaboration is essential. I absolutely agree around COVID. When COVID hit in 2020, nobody knew what was going on. We were living by the day, working out on a day-to-day basis how things were done. What I saw fairly quickly in the first 4 to 8 weeks was a step change in the level of collaboration. I'd have tier 2s, tier 3s saying they've had more conversations with tier 1s in the last 4 weeks than they've had in the last 4 years. Now, that may be accurate, it may be an emotive statement at the time, but either way, that was a fairly common statement. But it was the fact that everyone had to come together. I mean, nobody wishes a pandemic on anyone, but what it did do is accelerate the pace of change. Even on something like safety as a stats, we saw safety performance, the way we measure it across the sector, improve a bit because I'm convinced people were far more aware of their environments, but also people felt they were being looked after more by their employers at whatever tier in the supply chain. So people felt they were it was that show me you care bit. And everyone, employers, everyone was leaning in to sort of demonstrate that they cared about each other, they cared about their colleagues, company cared about employees, etc. And so we saw an improvement in safety performance because of that. And I don't think that's changed. I don't think we've lost that. I think that's carried through. Another example, we've been over the last 18 months, we've been doing some trial on applying lean techniques. So 6 major contractors been working with LCI, adopting lean techniques. In early days, when you said, right, let's have a launch meeting, it was very much LCI, ourselves, and the contractor. But as the trial went on, what you then saw was the contractor, the tier 1, were bringing in what I would term the critical tier 2s, things like the earthworks, the traffic management, the asphalt, concrete players, etc. And that level of collaboration, that level of working together is becoming more and more common and more important. There's still some gaps. I'm not always convinced that if you talk with people like Hanson AI, Tarmac, they're part of big global parent companies. They spend a lot of money on R&D. They know exactly where they're trying to go with their products to meet the different agendas, and that's why we're deliberately working very closely with them so they can understand our needs, so they can tailor their R&D spend to support our needs. But when you dig into it and say, well, do you think the tier ones, do you think the designers really understand where you're going? Some do, some don't. So I think in that, if we then shift left into that sort of R&D space, I think if we can have greater clarity about who's doing what without giving away commercial sensitivity, but greater understanding about what's coming down the pipeline, that in turn will also accelerate the pace of change through the design, through into the construction phase. So I think it's coming, but I think there's still more we can do. But it's absolutely vital we maintain the pace and we maintain, if anything, accelerate the speed.
And one of the things that we talked about a while ago is when we first met, we were talking about how the industry has got to change, but also you're talking about pace, like you mentioned there. And what I thought was really interesting, Malcolm, is there was a challenge from you that said, we want disruptors in this space. Yes, we've got to be safe. We've got these big organisations that you just mentioned, but we also want to be more accessible to technology disruptors, to new players, people with new ideas to come into the sector and help us change or help us just reinvent the way we're doing things. Like I spoke to one of your colleagues and it's like, drones spotting little tiny cracks in the pavement and going down and sticking some glue in there, kind of thing, and looking at how we can then map how we could look after that road better and share that information. But we also we are open now, aren't we, to people coming in from different walks of life, and actually we need a lot more people from elements for technology and digitalization to come into our industry to service our needs, don't we?
And if you look over the last 2 years, we've done some major technology-related procurements, and our language internally is OTCF and ITCF. OTCF is Operational Technology Commercial Framework, and ITCF is Information Technology Commercial Framework. Those two frameworks about 1.5 billion over the next 4 or 5 years, so big frameworks gone in. When you look at the suppliers that we have on those frameworks, yes, there are some of the traditional suppliers we've used, but more than half of the suppliers on those frameworks are new, and that's deliberate. So we've gone out there, we've had conversations, we have some of the bigger technology players on those frameworks, the same as we have some more niche technology players based on the different categories of the framework that we're looking at. It is about tapping in and being accessible and being open to the best. It's not about going to traditional players all the time, because you tend to get the same. It's okay, some traditional players maybe, oh yeah, but that's our market. But the reality is you have to have healthy competition. And healthy competition comes from constantly, gently recycling a supply base and bringing in new ideas and new challenges. And in the technology space, that speed of refresh and that speed of cycle is inevitably and has to be so much quicker. So we're always going to look for new players. Now, maybe we're talking to a new player and we're partnering them up with someone else to make it work because it's the most effective way. But equally, I said at the start about being clear on our intent. If we're clear on our intent, that allows new players to look at our potential marketplace and go, is it something that works for them? But equally, it means existing players can choose to decide where they invest their R&D money. If you don't invest, if you don't constantly refresh, you're going to go backwards. Just take the carbon agenda, the need to decarbonize. I don't find anyone that goes, don't believe it, everyone gets it. It's now really a case of the speed which you can do it. And we have to be realistic. It's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a long time to get there. We've got to be clear on what our intent is to encourage that investment and then catalyze change. And it's the warm mix asphalt debate. Once we had standardized on warm mix asphalt, very quickly, 2 of the major players said our default standard is warm mix asphalt. So again, as a client, once we're comfortable that there is a suitable products, a suitable technology available, we will adjust our standards to catalyze the change, to move the market forward in the sense of hot mix to warm mix asphalt. And we're going to do more and more of that. But that's another reason why, we spent a long time understanding the tiered supply base, introducing good old-fashioned category management to understand what's out there, what are the different players. We always are, and we will accelerate the pace of looking at new entrants, trying to bring new entrants into the market in different categories, just to catalyze and accelerate the pace of change, which is going to be so important. You've got to remember we're spending taxpayers' money, and taxpayers' money is not plentiful at the moment. It's our responsibility, and as taxpayers, nobody wants to pay more tax than they have to, but it's our responsibility to make sure we're getting the best possible return on every pound of taxpayers' money we spend. And that means we have to catalyse change, which is fine.
And what's that really interesting about that, Malcolm, is the fact that we now have the capability to measure more things. So we now have data capture. We now have data that's turned into information, sometimes in real time, but that we've got all the 3D maps. We've got the understanding of how something is built. And by having the data, we can actually look at what I call little mini impacts. I like, you're looking at the bigger picture stuff all the time, but it's the mini 1% or 0.1% improvement that actually helps deliver all of that extra value, isn't it? The data that you've got now must be absolutely crazy amounts, but how have you been using it and how have you been sharing the data? And something like the A14 is a great example of the projects where you've done that to make improvements. And what have they been able to allow you to do when you've got that physical number that says, yes, this works?
You take stuff like data sharing, what we're trying to do is standardize as much as we can. Now, as an organization, we don't want to have something that's unique to national highways. If there's a standard way of doing something, we just want to adopt the standard way of doing it. And if everyone is using a certain approach, a certain software, a certain format, we're just going to adopt that. We're not going to be saying we're special. We must have the national highways way, because otherwise, how do you get the benefit? How do you get the learning? How do you get the economies of scale and the acceleration? And you're right around the digital space. I mean, there is so much going on, and we're doing a load of thinking internally around how do we utilize digital tech more? How do we use it to forecast? How we plan interventions into the road network? I mean, it's all around the marginal gains. I remember, probably 10 years ago when British cycling was really banging out the gold medals. You had Chris Hoy and everyone coming through, the Kennys and everyone coming through. And British cycling always talks about marginal gains. There aren't the big silver bullets that give you that big step forward. It's all around marginal gains. And data is all about the marginal gains and using it to systematically understand and improve and drive that continuous improvement mindset in the business. Absolutely vital. And a couple of years ago, Vicky Higgin, who was the CIO 2 years ago, she helped us set up a forum with the supply-based players, all of their CIO equivalents. And that forum was there to have those more detailed technical conversations around, if we're going to standardize in a certain direction, what is it? How are we going to do it? So it wasn't us imposing, it was very much us working with the key players in the supply base, be it the engineering side, the contractor side, the specialist tier 2 side, so that we could develop that consensus and develop that uniformity, which meant everyone was able to operate and talk in the same way, share information in the same way. It's all about speed. It's all about velocity of information sharing and then applying that to the ground.
And I think that's also been seen in the PEC and the CAP group communities that you've created within the plant sector area, where everybody's coming together to define what the things that need to work and how they need to work. And also, it's the way that the construction leadership councils come together to ask for sector organisations to look at things like skills and like the development of the skills portfolios to make sure that everybody's learning in the right way, so that we do have operators, for example, that are all coming together with those baseline skills. So tell me a little bit about now what this big ESG is all about and what this big sustainability word is all about, because there's a huge amount of confusion in the industry. We've gone from using the word sustainability a lot to using the word ESG a lot to using carbon emissions and things like that. Fundamentally, there is so much within that space. How does somebody like National Highways define it, but also look at the different elements of ESG that come into play through your organisation and those that obviously are in your supply chain in the wider industry?
So you take ESG, and to me, it's two things. You've got the environmental bit, the carbon, the environmental, the biodiversity piece. That's one bit of it. And then you've got the social value piece, which is the second bit. I mean, we're using the government definition. The government definition is very broad, but once you go straight below that government definition, we break it out into it's carbon related or it's social value related. So it's easier to explain it in those two ways. So carbon related, we've been very clear. We've published the carbon net zero plan that takes through 2030, 2040, 2050. So we get to a net zero environment in the construction, maintenance and operating, and how we run our business, our own sort of corporate carbon. The biggest impact on the road sector from a carbon perspective is going to be the decarbonisation of vehicles, in the sense of electric vehicles, vans, heavy vehicles, hydrogen, electric, whatever goes. But and if you look at the speed, when you look at the different models for the speed of decarbonisation of transport, the transport sector drops quite significantly as you see that tilt point where more and more electric vehicles. What we're doing, really focusing on as a business, is enabling that on the network, but also driving the corporate emissions and the construction and maintenance emissions down. And we've been very, very clear in our net zero plan around what we're aiming to, or how we're aiming to do that. And as I touched on before about detailed roadmaps for asphalt, concrete, and steel, which are three of our big emitters. All of that work has been done, and it's just timing as to when we publish it. It's in the next 4 to 8 weeks when we publish it. But that's been done with the sector, trade bodies, key players, etc. So we're trying to create a consensus within the sector. This is how we decarbonise asphalt from X to Y in 5-year blocks, so everyone can see what's coming, everyone can see what investment and change are needed. So that's in the sort of the carbon piece. Then you've obviously got the biodiversity element, where the legislation coming through is around no net biodiversity loss, even going into net biodiversity gain. So the biodiversity piece is vitally important as well, around the different schemes, how we maintain it. And we're now looking at, when you look at the amount of land that we own within the country, we're a pretty big landowner, but we've got lots of different pockets, and we're now looking at how can we utilise those pockets of land, the stretch of land by the sides of the roads, etc. How can we utilise that and really turn that from just being a maintained area into an area that is really enhancing the biodiversity of that geographic area that it's in. And internally around the carbon piece, when we look at investments, we previously would look at investments from a cost, a time, and a BCR, an economic benefit. What we've been doing the last 12 months is adding in a carbon factor. So when we're considering investments, we're looking at cost, time, economic benefit, as well as the carbon. And are we bringing carbon down as low as we can? So a massive amount of work in the carbon space, and Steve Elderkin's the guy internally that's really leading that and setting the agenda and driving it forward. If you look at the social value piece, which is the other half of ESG, everyone I talk to is convinced we do a vast amount, but everyone will also say, but we never add it up. We've never added it up. And I do think, from what I've seen in this sector, I see, compared to other sectors I've worked in, I've seen so much social value stuff going on that it's really, really impressive. And what we've done there, and this comes back to what I said about standardizing and just using what's proven best practice. As an organisation, again, we've published our social value plan, same approach as the carbon plan, and the social value plan goes 23, 24 and into 25 calendar years. And really the thrust of the social value plan is we're working out how much social value is actually going on within the sector, so that we can highlight the value that we're adding from a social value perspective, but also understand what's going really well and where we may have a few gaps. And we will strike another plan for road period 3, so 25 onwards. But the next couple of years are about really adding it up in that standard way, standard supply chain sustainability score, 29 metrics. So we're all operating the same way. And again, the collaboration piece, just to flip back to the collaboration piece, social value is led by Andrew Stevenson, who's one of my players. He runs procurement within CMP. And he's established a supplier working group of about 35 suppliers. And it's if anything, it's more been about we've had to turn a few people away because there's so much interest in getting involved. And you've got players, all the big players are in there. And it's co-chaired by, apologies, I cannot remember her name, but co-chaired by the lady from Kier, who's really, really good and really strong in this space. And they're working it through in the sense of how, as a sector, do we come together to really help get that picture and then take that picture forward and demonstrate what it means. We're not being prescriptive, we're laying out our intent so that everyone, region by region, company by company, scheme by scheme, has got the ability to decide what's best for the environment they're in, but to measure and record it in the same way. My favourite on social value is Royal British Legion Industries. Part of Royal British Legion, everyone gets the importance of the poppy appeal. And what they run is a factory for ex-veterans, or veterans, ex-servicemen and women who just need a bit of help. For whatever reason they fall on the hard times, a bit of help. If you ever visit the factory, which is well worth doing, at the moment, there's a fair number of people that have come from Afghanistan, Iraq conflicts, where it's not uncommon to see people minus limbs. And what they do there is they run a factory that makes signs, and road signs, rail signs, etc. And what we did in January last year, there was Eurovia, Amy, Colas, Chevron, Martins, and the Traffic Management Contract Association and ourselves came together, and we struck a deal and said we were aiming to spend about 850,000 with them in the current fiscal year, which ends March this year, in order to help them. Because if we invest, we buy signs. If we invest some of that, and there's no way that is anywhere near the total amount of money we spend on signs. If we invest some of that money on signs into a social value organisation like that, you can see the direct, tangible benefit of a veteran that comes forward saying, "I just need some help," to then working through the RBLI systems, then returning to society, having given so much. I mean, there's people there that were from the Falklands conflicts, there's people there from Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts, etc. People there from Northern Ireland, people forget about Northern Ireland, but people there from the Troubles that just need a bit of help. And it's a way of spending money that helps society. And that bringing 6 organisations together with us, what it means is that amount of money to them means that they can employ more veterans, they can look after more people. That's the example I use around social value, but there's so many examples of that all the way through the area. And the social value piece we've been doing is all about just pulling that together, so as a sector we can demonstrate the good we're adding, not only the tangible, the road bit, but that societal benefit. So they're the 2 bits really. You've got the carbon biodiversity bit, you've got the social value bit, and we're very clear in what we're doing now as an organisation. And now we've been able to work through that clarity of intent. Now we've just got to help people deliver so we can demonstrate the success of what it is.
And it's kind of like when you're sort of talking about they're measuring this impact, you can't understand what that value is unless you actually have these sort of standardizations. It's a bit like the data from the machines that you've got in. It's understanding everything that comes through, because every penny that we put into these things and these projects actually comes back into our society, but also back into the UK PLC to be spent elsewhere, in the economy. And we all know that construction, and in particular larger projects, put so much money back into the economy and obviously improve roads and improve transportation so that we can actually stop burning carbon and stop actually having lots and lots of different spends that are unnecessary, because we're actually doing things well. And I think the most important things with the skills piece is also to recognise that as we go through a very swift transition, we've got to look at how we take the community, whether that be young people coming into it or older people still having another 10 years left of working in the industry, along that journey with us, and invest in their skill sets and their careers. And that's really important as we go through what this digitalization, technology, continuous change is. And how are your thoughts on that, Malcolm? Because it is big, the things that we've done, and it's even bigger what we've got to do as we move forward, isn't it?
The sector, and one of the challenges the sector has is its overall productivity. It's not brilliant compared to other sectors when you look in relation to productivity improvements over whatever period of time. But I think there's a major change in the fact we need to decarbonise, which is fantastic, because that will catalyse different thinking. 5 years ago, would people have been thinking about using hydrogen as an alternate fuel? Probably not. I never heard it coming up in conversations where I worked. And all of a sudden now people are seriously looking at hydrogen as an alternate to, say, fossil fuels, be it for plant, for heavy vehicles. Also, you then look at the technology. And the reality is, if you look at the average employee in the sector, it is a bit male dominated. But you look at other industries, like the mining industry in Australia. Some of the mines inland in Australia, they're not the most hospitable places. So you get many of the large haul trucks have been operated by people sitting in cities like Perth, operating things remotely. You look at the military, and they've got the ability to fly drones from Suffolk over Afghanistan and Iraq. And you look at how we could apply that technology into our sector, and we should be using more and more tech to advance productivity, to advance the diversity. We had the collaboration board, which is a group of key suppliers are in, from the supply base that work together, including the Titan and Sense Collaboration Board. And May last year, we went to Caterpillar up in Leicester. And one of their demos was you were sitting in a games console type of chair, and you were you're operating a bit of plant in Arizona. Now, okay, it's there to demonstrate the capability. But if we want to attract and have a greater productivity and have a greater diversity in the workforce, why are we insisting that people have to trudge through loads of heavy mud when you could do some of this stuff in different ways, thinking differently, that drives it differently. We should be using technology to measure the overall productivity and the utilization of equipment, because that then would challenge us to say, why have we got X, Y, Z? Why aren't we doing things differently? And there's companies out there with different software that enable you to do that in the plant space. So we have to embrace technology to catalyze change, to bring the right type of people. Now, you imagine if we've got a far greater number of remotely operated vehicles on sites, where you've got somebody sitting in a porter cabin or somewhere operating the equipment, you completely change the dynamic of the type of person that you want. And all of a sudden, you become more attractive to a different level, a different type of person in society. But that's where we've got to go. When you're looking at the use of technology, the use of skills, the skills that we need today, you will always need the skills we have today. But equally, you've got to understand the skills we potentially need in the future. My son's 17, does his A-levels this year. Any generation like that, PlayStations they're part of it. Why wouldn't you be taking that type of PlayStation technology, as Caterpillar trying to do, and use it in our environment? That's what we've got to do. And as a client, we've got to help catalyze that change. Large schemes like Lower Thames, Matt, who runs Lower Thames, he would love to have, massive use of hydrogen on plant in Lower Thames, just to act as the scale of the scheme, to act as that catalyzer to demonstrate it can be done, or use of remote technology. This is what we've got to be open to. We have to be open to change and improve, because if we do that, we will attract a completely different skill set and we'll be better for it as an industry.
I totally agree. And one of the things that I'd like to come back to is you're talking about veterans that may have lost limbs or legs and things like that. And you talk in the industry about operators that may have something like a bad back, or they've had an injury, but they're really highly skilled. Well, that remote station can be somewhere where they can get into a nice environment, get into the chair and still do their job, and actually deliver those skills out to the job site as they were doing many times before. So it's an enabler on lots of different levels, this sort of technology. I've actually tried it myself, Malcolm, and I was absolutely horrendous at operating the dozer at the Malaga facility, where I was fortunate to do that last year. But the technologies are there, and people like my son with 3D machine control, he's only 15, he's tested that out, and I think that's really impactful for those people. And if we are to be more attractive than manufacturing and other areas and technology players, then we've got to look at that and say, how do we actually talk to people and young people who still think if you're going to be in construction, you'll be outside in the rain trying to lay a brick in the freezing cold, and it's not an inclusive industry. It absolutely is. And because we're so big, and the organisations like yours are large organisations, that you need all sorts of skills, from accountancy, not just to being on site, lawyers, etc., because we're a big industry in itself. And I think one of the things I'd like to move on to now is this roadmap to zero, Malcolm, because it's what I've talked about a lot of the last couple of years, and the challenge for people is to get their head around it. So when we talked before about carbon, we're talking about, if we get a road to zero, we actually have to have negative carbon in some respects. We don't have to have we can't achieve a net zero without taking carbon out of some of the equations, because no matter what we do, we're not going to actually change overnight to hydrogen. We've got diesel machines that are actually going to be emitting those gases for some time. So the roadmap to zero, it's something that we've got to think about now and what we can achieve with what's available right now, but also plan for the future, because you've put your stake in the ground. But the challenges that I see are people have got to move backwards from that stake in the ground to actually the delivery element to get to that stake. So we've got to go 2 or 3 years backwards to test the right technology. We've got to advance in the new ways of using materials and the new ways of doing things. And we've got to prove that in your proving ground, then take it onto the big site and prove it to actually get to that roadmap to net zero timing. And so that is a huge challenge to get your head round. And, you guys are leading that. And, there are other big projects like HS2 that are, coming in to support, longer term investment in the sector. But you've put yourself out there, and it's a big challenge, isn't it?
When I joined National Highways in 2019, carbon wasn't really discussed. And it's only really started to be discussed heavily in about 2020. Then, since then, we've accelerated. Everyone is quite passionate about it. Lower Thames has been tendered very much as a carbon lighthouse scheme to demonstrate how it can be done. And when we were looking on Lower Thames, so right, on major infrastructure, how have major infrastructure projects been tendered for carbon in the past? There weren't many examples. Now, it's not because people haven't bothered. It's just because you look at the scale and the timing of major infrastructure. The last major tendering on infrastructure was probably around HS2 in a big way. And when that was being tendered, the carbon agenda wasn't on the horizon. It wasn't being discussed. It wasn't there. So Lower Thames, when we've been tendering that on the tunnels, the roads north and roads south, we've had to work out how to do it. So we're learning, and what we've done in 2022 and we're doing in 2023, I'm sure in 3 years' time will be different. But equally, if another major project, or somebody came and said, how do you do it? We'll share what we've done, because it's important people don't just hold on to it. So the tendering piece is challenging to get people to commit. And what we've been saying on Lower Thames is you can write what you like in your bid documentation, but whatever you write has got to be contractualized, so that we're not getting a bid writer's glossy brochure. We're getting firm commitments that are going to be built into the contract, which we're going to hold people to. So people have had to think very carefully about how you do it. If you take our roadmap that we're doing, we use our roadmap in the sense we're looking at it 2020 to 2025, 25 to 30, 2030, 35, 35, 40, and then post 2040 on asphalt, for instance. We think by 2040, we would have, if you turn around and say as of 2020, we're 100% carbon, by 2040, we'll be down at 22%. So we won't eliminate it entirely, but we can get down to 22%. And that'll be things like lower carbon in construction plant, increasing the level of recycling, warm mix to cold mix over time, switching fuel at plants. And some companies are trialing hydrogen burning in plants already to see if that's better than fossil, reducing the bitumen content, et cetera, et cetera. All of these dimensions are the areas that we're trialing. But in that case on asphalt, and the same on concrete and the same on steel, we've worked it up with the industry, with the sector. And the advantage there is then if people are saying, okay, the big opportunity to change the source of fuel in, say, asphalt plants is, I make it up, in 2030, 2035, they know that what we're looking for, therefore there's certainty of their investment. And when we see that coming through and we get to that time when we said by this date and time, we want the following, we will flip the standards so that we're able to catalyze and create the market. We don't, asphalt, we buy a lot of cells and lay a lot on the operational side, but we can catalyze the markets by the nature of our spending power and the clarity of intent that we provide. Now, if we don't do that, somebody has to do it. But if we're the biggest buyer, we're certainly the biggest buyer of asphalt in the UK and coming up to be one of the biggest buyers of concrete. If we can help set that direction that becomes adopted by the broader industry, because everyone looks and go, yeah, it makes sense. It's common sense. It's very, very sensible stuff. And it's supported by the direction of technology, then that has to be a good thing. And that's what we're aiming to do. And where we can't get to 100% reduction of carbon, that's where I said earlier around the looking at our softer state, looking at our physical land that we own and utilising that in a far better way to increase the level of biodiversity or carbon absorption, et cetera. The whole thing has to come together so we get to the optimal level as low as we can go.
And this is where other things that you've launched recently. I spoke to one of your colleagues, Dr. Joanna, earlier last year, in fact, about the Roads Research Alliance. And this is where bodies like that, with a chunk of money that's not just come from National Highways but other organisations as well, come into play, isn't it? Because you can have a wider thought process about how do we make roads of the future? How do we embed carbon into the roads of the future? How do we electrify our national highways space so that actually we can look at how we work with data and technology to actually look at tiny little sensors that are telling us all these different things about the actual infrastructure that we've got, so that we can look at prioritizing certain things over other things? And then how do we, when we go and set up a big project like the Thames, how do we actually maybe put in the hydrogen infrastructure that allows us to do the refueling and do that before we're even setting up the road infrastructure, because you've got the sides of those roads to put in that sort of infrastructure. This sort of stuff is again really important, that these projects are actually put together and they've got, I think it's a lifespan of about 5 years for the Roads Research Alliance. but actually that they're moving forward again in a collaborative way with all these different organisations, from Cambridge University all the way through to the engineers and the teams that are putting the visions together to delivery partners.
I mean, it's absolutely vital because it's tapping into the capabilities of, UK academia, UK PLC, whichever descriptor you want. But it is around that clarity. This is what we're aiming to achieve. This is where we think the R&D world is going. This is what we need to have. And then you bring the minds together. The Research Alliance is really, really important. These things take time. I mean, you'll get some people go, well, where is it? 6 months on, where's the results? These things take time. And the reason why the government set up the catapults, like the Manufacturing Technology Centre, was, their language, they talk about the valley of death. Whereas a country, we're great at doing academic research. The best example you always get quoted is graphene. There's some really brilliant academics developed graphene. They went around the world and explained what graphene was. By the time they came back, a load of people have patented it. So we're really good at developing stuff. We, as a country, we've always struggled a bit in converting academic research into physical products that people see and use in their day-to-day life. And so things like the MCC, things like the Road Research Alliance, it's all around how do we accelerate that, the brilliance of the minds you've got in the UK into stuff that we can actually do versus the future we're going. Now, again, if we don't lean in, if we don't do that, if we don't put the effort into making that work, it's hard to see who else would do that within the sector. Because it's, again, I talk about the unwritten role of a client. We're here to deliver the SRN, maintain, develop, evolve the SRN, but we're also here to catalyse change. And in my world, it's catalysing change in the supply base. Road Research Alliance, catalysing change in the R&D space to develop and pull products through, etc. The client organisation in any sector has to really have their mind on catalysing change and looking at where the future's going and helping to shape the future fundamentally.
And that's all comes back to the benefits of collaboration and information sharing, which you're now more and more open to doing, not just within the industry, but actually the Roads Research Alliance has got some funding from the EU, and therefore sharing the things that we learn in a global sense allows us to sort of reach the global roadmap to zero faster. But Malcolm, I want to finish off this podcast with some of the things that are in your brain and exciting you right now as we move forward in the next year to 2 years that we're going to see coming into the national highways and the rest of the industry in a big way. And what are you excited about?
If you're looking at stuff that really that I think is just intriguing, and I think we're at that sort of VHS Betamax moment. So you and I will get that. Other people may just scratch heads and go, "What are you on about?" But I look at hydrogen fuel, and I just think that there's something there. And everyone says, and you see stuff about the size of a diesel tank versus the size of a hydrogen fuel tank. Gee whiz, we move combustible gases around the country by road, rail, whatever, all over the place. But I look at someone like JCB that could take a diesel engine, slice the top off, put a hydrogen injection system onto the top of their standard diesel engine and use it on hydrogen. I just look at it and go, why can't we do more of that? Hydrogen's been used on buses, etc. I'm not a techie. I don't understand the battery technology. I'm not sure how big the batteries will be to move a 40-ton lorry and stuff like that. But I just think something like hydrogen is one of those game changers that could come through. Could it be used for domestic heating? Don't know. Should we be trialling it as a country? Is the government right to invest in that? Absolutely. But I think something that's really exciting for society, but certainly for our sector, is around hydrogen, because I think battery can go so far, but I think once you go beyond that, I'm not convinced that batteries will be able to power some of the scale and the size of stuff we need, because we as an industry can't rely on umbilicals off mains power, because we're not in the middle of a town. We just can't do it. I think in the carbon space, something like hydrogen, completely off the wall. 3, 4, 5 years ago, you say, what do you think alternate fuels are? It would have been biodiesel, it would have been cleaner diesel, it would have been electric. Hydrogen's coming in there fast. I just think that could be a real game changer in some of it. One thing we haven't touched on as a sector, we've got to get better at productivity. We've got to get better at quality. And you look at, could we reduce carbon by being far more productive and far higher levels of quality? Absolutely. And so you would have heard Highways people, Mark Ollerton, talked at Highways UK about getting the basics right. We really do as a sector have to focus in on the basics, because if we get the basics right, we're more productive, potentially we deliver early and under budget, which means we've got more money to invest in the road network, and we make a step change for generations to come. You blend that with digital technology, be it drones or be it robotics and remotely operated vehicles, etc., etc. I think those things have got to come through. I think the plant space, it's harder to see because the plant market is very much global, and we are relatively small on the global scale. But if players like JCB and others wants to trial stuff on our sites, we're open to that. You can't do it all at Lower Thames in one hit, in one go, because it's so much change on a what is a really big complex project. You've got to get into small steps, marginal gains, trials. But I think the use of tech is going to become more and more, and it's not going to be the wow factor overnight. Bang! Look at this. It's going to be. We're going to look back in 5 years' time and go, "There's so much more going on." Level of collaboration, it's got to accelerate. You touched on earlier about the use of plant standardizing data standards for plant. Well, a lot of that has come, in fact, all of that has come from the plant community via the collaboration board, which Mark Lawton leads. And if the sector's going and saying this is what we standardize on, we'll do it. So it's very much leaning in. But I think there's so much to go for. You listen to what the government's saying. Okay, the economy's in hard times. The national position isn't as good as it has been in the past. But the government is still talking about investing heavily in infrastructure. And if we as a sector don't step up and really demonstrate that investment, you put a pound in, you get real hard, tangible value and intangible value out of that. If we don't do that and we don't use that to change and become attractive for the next generation, we've got a real problem. But I think we can, providing we accelerate the pace of change and keep thinking differently.
Malcolm, it's great to finally get the big chat down with you for the big podcast today, and there's so much exciting things going on. I know I talked to you and your colleagues before. I would love to continue to follow you and the team on your journey as we go through all of these different facets, the trials, the tribulations, and also the very exciting Thames Crossing project, which I believe is going to be another game changer. It's our A14 of the moment, where that was delivered under budget and that was delivered faster, and therefore we can have the road to zero mapped out for us in a big project like that we can all be very proud of. Malcolm, been a pleasure to get you on the podcast. Thanks very much for coming on today.
No worries, good to talk.
And of course, this podcast wouldn't be possible without the support of Leica Geosystems. They're the 3D machine control and surveying specialists, and they can help you be more productive and more profitable using a range of their services and equipment. To find out more, visit leica-geosystems.com. And thanks to you, the listeners, for spending some time with me today. And until the next time, goodbye.